Hello there, my name is Artie, and it's the best month of the year, Spooky Month, which means it's time to talk horror games. Specifically, indie horror games, and the absolute state they've been in recently, thanks to a little genre called Mascot horror. Today I'm talking about the history of Mascot horror and why I think it's the worst thing that's ever happened to the indie horror game scene. I should probably preface this video by saying, obviously, not all Mascot horror games are bad. There are a few shining examples of great ways in which the genre has been applied to new and innovative ideas, but the unfortunate truth is that most Mascot horror games take a lazy approach to maximize popularity and profit. Before I talk about that though, let's backtrack a bit to the first and by far most notable game of the genre, Five Nights at Freddy's. Let's be honest, we all know this game, so I won't waste too much of your time explaining it. All you really need to know is that it was released in 2014 by budding developer Scott Cawthon, following criticisms of his other games, such as Chipper & Sons Lumber Co., and took the internet by storm. Huge creators at the time, Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, MatPat, all made content on the game, sparking its massive popularity. This prompted Cawthon to follow up with a bunch of sequels, more of which are still being made to this day. It is impossible to understate this game's massive impact on the indie horror scene, and in fact, the entire gaming scene as a whole. And you can see why that first game got so popular. It does a great job of building up a really unsettling atmosphere with its ambient audio, realistic visuals, and expert twists on restaurants like Chuck E. Cheese, turning something childlike and fun into something far more sinister. And whilst jump scares are usually a bit of a cop-out, they work quite well here as a payoff. There's no doubt about the fact that the first FNAF game is damn good. There's also no doubt about the fact that part of its popularity is due to its simplicity. The game has an extraordinarily simple gameplay loop. Check cameras, check doors, close doors, repeat. Thanks to its simplicity, a whole heap of people began to make FNAF fan games, seemingly one of the internet's favourite pastimes back in the mid-2010s. Scrolling GameJolt today, you can easily find thousands and thousands of FNAF likes, some better than others. For a while, these fan games were just that, FNAF fan games and nothing more. It wasn't long though until other games, ones that weren't strictly based on FNAF, began to use elements of the game in their own contexts, with new characters, environments and gameplay features. It's difficult to say exactly who defined the term mascot horror and when they did it, as the term seems to have been around as long as FNAF itself. That said, it doesn't really matter. Many other games quickly took up the mantle, including 2017's Bendy and the Ink Machine, 2018's Baldi's Basics in Education and Learning, 2021's Poppy Playtime, 2022's Amanda the Adventurer, and 2023's Garten of Banban, amongst many, many others. All of these games revolved around some kind of central antagonist or group of antagonists based on some kind of corrupted childhood idea. Bendy had its evil cartoon monsters, Baldi had an evil schoolteacher, Poppy Playtime has evil toys, Amanda the Adventurer has evil Dora the Explorer, and I couldn't even begin to tell you what Garten of Banban's got. The point is, FNAF spawned this trend of lazily getting some childhood thing, adding dead children to the mix and calling it a day. Apart from Bendy, which has its flaws, but otherwise does a genuinely great job at having its own style and building up a creepy atmosphere, most of these games rely on cheap jump scares, mediocre fetch quest heavy gameplay, and their spooky mascots to make the game good. The question you may be asking at this point though is, what exactly makes this genre so bad? Well, I've narrowed it down to a handful of points ranging from lazy design to oversaturation. Let's have a look. Character design seems to have become much more lazy alongside the rise of mascot horror. If we look back at FNAF 1, specifically the animatronic characters themselves, you notice something. They look realistic. If I walked into a Chuck E. Cheese, I wouldn't bat an eye if I saw the FNAF 1 animatronics on stage, and that's where half of the game's creep factor comes from. They're not overly freaky, they don't look unrealistic, but they have that uncanny valley vibe that real animatronics have, and the fact that they're hunting you down is what makes the game scary. Now let's look at Poppy Playtime and its mascots. First off, we have Huggy Wuggy, this massive ball of fluff, which, let's be honest, looks nothing like it'd be a kid's toy, which is, you know, the point of the game. And how do they make this thing scary? They give it teeth. Ah, terrifying. Poppy Playtime is probably one of the worst offenders here, with its frankly just plain bad character design, and whilst I could maybe see some of the other creatures you find in the game being somewhat realistic kids' toys, it's generally a far cry from a game like FNAF 1. That's not to say that Poppy Playtime is the only offender though. As I mentioned, you've got whatever the hell this is in Garten of Banban, and some bald guy in Baldi's Basics, and more characters that they just added teeth and stuff to in Amanda the Adventurer and Bendy and the Ink Machine. It's really a shame, because there is genuinely opportunity to make good looking characters. I think designers just need to realise that adding more teeth does not make their character scarier. One of the biggest reasons I think mascot horror is detrimental to the indie horror scene is the sheer saturation of it. There are so many mascot horror games, and it seems many developers are seeing the genre as a quick and easy get-rich-quick scheme. Once again, just thinking of some random childlike object and making it chase you down a corridor. There's a clear agenda from some developers to prioritise making their characters more marketable than scary. I mean, go to any website like Temu or any off-brand market stall in a shopping centre and you'll see countless Garten of Banban and Poppy Playtime plushies. That's not to mention things like Mob Entertainment's Poppy Playtime NFTs and the fact that they were locking story elements behind getting all of them in a clear, shameless attempt to squeeze money out of their audience. On that topic, it's obvious that the main thing that drives the mascot horror genre is money, more so than any other genre of game. If we look back at the FNAF series and its literal mountains of merchandise, it's very clear that many other developers wanted to replicate that, giving a lot of the games of the genre this hollow feel because the games are pretty much only there to sell merchandise. So yeah, the genre is super saturated because everyone wants a piece of the merch tie-in pie, but this profit-driven agenda isn't the worst thing about how many mascot horror games there are. In my opinion, the worst thing is that it takes the spotlight away from other, better indie horror games. Because these speedily produced mascot horrors are so quick to the limelight, smaller games from smaller studios which take more risks are significantly less likely to be properly recognised by the general public. The saturation of the genre is also encroaching onto other games too. Let's look at Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion, a game by horror dev Akuma Kira, by far one of the best indie horror devs around nowadays. Anyway, the game's basically a parody of games which over-rely on jump scares, and in an ironic twist, a bunch of fans begged Kira to add a FNAF-based character to the game. Something like this suggests that other indie devs could have scrapped would-be amazing ideas in exchange for a cheap mascot horror character simply because that's more popular. There's another trend which has started to crop up within these games, something which Bendy introduced in 2017, a chapter-based story released over a fairly long period of time. For Bendy, the first chapter released in early 2017, and the fifth and final chapter released in late 2018. This is fine, but releasing only 5 40-minute-ish chapters over the course of 2 years leaves a little to be desired. I know that the game design takes a hell of a lot of time and all, but games like No Man's Sky and Fallout 76 have proven time and time again where developers should spend extra time making a more polished, complete game. Since Bendy, many other games have taken a similar approach to game releases, including Poppy Playtime, Garten of Banban, and Indigo Park. Again, game design takes a lot of time, I know that, but this really doesn't seem like the most optimal way to release your game. I should preface this part by saying that what I'm about to talk about, for the most part, is not wholly the fault of the game developers. Something I find majorly wrong with a lot of mascot horror games is the childlike facade with typically really dark themes. I understand that this is the point of the genre, to creepily corrupt a childhood item, but the problem arises when these games lean too much into the childlike aesthetic. I'm sure many of you have seen the twisted corner of the internet that is YouTube Kids, which as of recent has completely been swamped with these awful, underproduced videos featuring characters from mascot horror games. I remember seeing a little kid once, no older than 6, wearing a Poppy Playtime shirt, and I was genuinely disturbed. The game's plot revolves around illegal experiments on children. Why is a child wearing a shirt from that game? Of course, like I said, this isn't wholly the fault of the developers. When something gets popular, as Mascot horror games tend to do, it's bound to be sucked up by the weird AI content farms over on YouTube Kids. That said, this wouldn't happen if game designers focused more on being actually scary than appealing to kids. You don't see this kind of content being made out of games like Dead Space or PT. Mascot horror games seem to have almost dumbed down horror, and whilst on one hand it may help to introduce a younger audience to the genre, many of these games are straight up too mature for a younger audience, despite what their colourful facade might make you think. There's no doubt about the fact that FNAF lends a lot of its popularity to MatPat and the game theorists, and vice versa. Their series of FNAF game theories was, and to be honest still is, one of the most popular horror game related things on the internet, so it makes sense why other developers might want to try and replicate the particularly convoluted story of FNAF in order to get onto an episode of game theory. Let's look at Hello Neighbor, for example, a game that kind of slots into the mascot horror genre in that it is a horror game with a mascot, albeit one that isn't based on some corrupted childhood thing. The developers, Dynamic Pixels, have been practically begging over on Twitter for ages, asking the game theorists to make a video looking at their trailer. This is, honestly, a problem. If you're writing a purposefully cryptic and obtuse story with the goal of pandering to online theorists instead of focusing on a story that the average player is going to fully understand, you're writing a bad story. But that's not to say that you can't leave stuff there for people to theorize about. Once again, linking back to FNAF 1, that was a really well executed implementation of the cryptic story. The game was complete on its own. You could finish it fully without ever noticing the newspaper clippings that reveal the story about the child murders that happened at the restaurant. But if you did discover it, you could fairly easily piece together a cohesive story which simply provides more context to the game. Unfortunately, the series didn't continue like this, and the story just became extremely convoluted extremely quickly, meaning only a small percentage of players were able to fully appreciate the game once it began to rely more on its overly cryptic plot. Overall, confusing and convoluted isn't always good. It naturally works in some cases where it's either used sparingly or as part of something like an ARG, a game directed specifically towards an audience that wants to solve puzzles and knows what they're in for. The problem is, like I said, when normal games inhibit their own story by being too complicated. I feel like if games were slightly more obvious in their major storytelling and instead try to hide less important information, which just provides more context, a lot of the mascot horror games I've already mentioned would be a noticeable amount better. One thing that I don't want any of you to come away from this video thinking is that I hate mascot horrors. I'm not trying to say that all mascot horror games are automatically bad, I'm just saying that a lot of them just happen to be bad, whether that be thanks to lazy writing, lazy game design, pandering to theorists, or really anything else I've discussed already. Mascot horror games can be good. I've already mentioned what the first FNAF game does right, as well as a handful of things Bendy and the Ink Machine does well. I should also mention that Bendy's sequel, The Dark Revival, is a huge improvement on the first game. It released all at once, has less repetitive gameplay, far better character design, and so on. I've also heard really good things about My Friendly Neighborhood, a Resident Evil style survival horror game with puppets. Whilst, yes, it's not very scary, it doesn't really try to be, unlike some other mascot horror games which just fail in trying to do so. It also has far more diverse gameplay and doesn't just rely on fetch quests like a few other games I could mention. I also want to make it really clear that I do not hate any of the games I've mentioned in the video, nor do I hate their respective developers. My goal here is to just try giving some constructive feedback on a genre which I think has a lot of untapped potential, one which could produce some honestly brilliant horror games if developers looked at what other games are doing right and tried to implement some new ideas. The sad truth is that a lot of these games suffer from the laziness of the developers, who think that they can get huge amounts of popularity by applying a boring formula to the game, and, unfortunately, they're correct. Until we as an audience stop encouraging this repetitive and boring game design by giving these games popularity, we're going to continue to see more and more of these frankly bad games continue to appear. So yeah, those are my thoughts. If you made it this far, thanks for listening, and if you have anything you'd like to add, or any counterpoints, please do leave them in the comments. This is a topic I'd love to discuss with you guys, just keep it civilized. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your spooky month. I'll see you at some point in the future. Goodbye.